It's 25 years since I was here last. Okay, so anyway, let me move quickly on from that point. Right, the year is 1649, and this is Charles I of England getting his head chopped off. And that raised new questions about how we govern ourselves as a country. Do we do it from the top down, or do we do it from the bottom up? At almost the same time in Oxford, Dr. Thomas Willis was taking brains out of heads and fixing them with a new technique that brought the brain into view in a new way. It gave us neuroscience. It also gave us a new question about how we govern ourselves. Is it from the top down, or it used to be from the heart, from the bottom up? One of his students, Dr. John Locke, created psychology at this time. Looking at the brain as a machine, he figured it was a machine for making associations, and this, of course, is the basis for things like Google now, so it's highly topical. A further person from the Oxford group was a Dr. William Petty, who helped finance Cromwell a few months later to invade Ireland, which has created the Brexit problem that we have now. Petty went over to Ireland and had a job to survey the Irish and their resources. And in surveying them, he created a new economic technique. He was the first person to create a GDP for a country. And with great irony, he was the first person to propose a free trade agreement between two countries, between Ireland and England. This is the first free trade proposal ever. His view was we need to govern ourselves from the bottom up, not the top down. He also did other things. Along with John Graunt, he looked at the mortality in London and Dublin and showing for the first time what people were actually dying from. And he was the first to propose that we should judge treatments not by their theoretical coherence, but by their outcomes. Did people actually live longer on this treatment rather than that? This is our first hints of evidence-based medicine. Petty called his work a political medicine. Now, 100 years later, what Petty had done had given rise to economics and had given rise to medicine, or public health medicine, in Paris in particular. And these forces came together to lead to Louis XVI having his head chopped off. Philippe Pinel, who was one of the creators of the medical model, was in the crowd at the time when this happened. But what I want you to focus on is that Louis had his head chopped off by a new and more efficient technique. The guillotine, which was invented by a doctor, was so efficient that lots of people thought that maybe the head could think and feel for a while after it was chopped off. And actually, the empirical evidence suggests that it can. So let me move forward. Louis' decapitation led to 50 years of unrest across Europe, which culminated in the springtime of the nations in 1848. And a few months before that happened, Rudolf Virchow had been sent by the Berlin government to Silesia to look at the state of health there, and had come back saying that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. This is a wonderful phrase, and led George Rosen, 100 years later, who was from the States and couldn't get into medicine in New York because he was a Jew, to come in the 1930s to Berlin to study medicine, where he could get into medicine, and he discovered, or created the myth of Rudolf Virchow as the patron saint of social medicine. Virchow, in fact, was very much a biomedical person. He was the person who picked out the cell as the root of all disease, and was quite anti a lot of the social inputs to medicine. He was anti-socialism. But 1848 was a period which was shaped heavily by public health doctors who had been describing in Paris and New York and Liverpool and elsewhere the state of the new public health state of the working class. And the descriptions they gave were almost identical to the description given by Friedrich Engels of the working class in England, who were largely Irish at this time, and Engels, as you may know, may have been influenced by the fact that he had an Irish mistress. But Engels and Marx, when the revolutions broke out in 1848, rushed out the Communist Manifesto, which everybody sees as a political document these days, but it's almost identical in thrust to the political medicine of the day. People like Virchow and Marx were identical on a whole bunch of points. They figured the solution to the state of affairs is to give people the vote, is to educate them. Both saw the state was going to wither away. The difference between them was that Engels and Marx saw the working class as the revolutionary class, and Virchow saw doctors as the revolutionary class. And this so concerned Bismarck. I mean, at this point, medicine was a revolutionary force and it was allied to socialism, and Bismarck was unhappy at that, aware of the threat this posed. So, at that time, aware that insurance could stabilize risky industries like the rail industry, risky things like the new tourism industry, risky things generally were being stabilized by insurance. Bismarck came up with the idea of stabilizing the new nation state, which had just been born, with health insurance. This is the first health insurance proposal we had, which also helped capture medicine for the state, because in order to actually make health insurance work, doctors had to register with the state and become agents of the state. They stopped being allied to the socialist causes. Now I want to take you back to 1848. We usually think of the kind of medicine we have now as being a thing that began in France and Germany and not the United States. In 1845, anesthesia was discovered in Boston. It raised a whole new question, which was, is it right, do the ends justify the means? Is it right to take a risk of killing people in order to do good? Because the drugs we had then to put people to sleep regularly killed people, just as they do still now. Medicines generally are a poison. Is it right to do good through the use of a poison? And the answer we gave was, yes, it is. And this answer underpinned the development of surgery in the American Civil War. There were new techniques like guns causing new injuries, which led to a bunch of surgeons to develop new operations, which they could do with anesthesia. It also led the US Army to set up first aid, to set up the first Red Cross, to set up triage on the battlefield and just behind the battlefield, to set up a grid of hospitals behind the battle lines, to put hygiene in place before Lister, to introduce effective analgesia through new techniques. The hypodermic syringe was used for the first time during the Civil War, in essence. And this has set the template for a lot of what we regard as healthcare now today, which is all of the urban grid of hospitals we have. We don't have them all in the one place. We have hospitals on a grid so that people can access them quickly if they get injured. That comes from the war. The idea of having an emergency department comes from the Civil War. The idea of having ambulances comes from the Civil War. The idea of disaster planning, training the citizens in first aid, this all comes from the American Civil War. Health hasn't been a case of something that's come from biomedicine or social medicine or public medicine or private medicine. A lot of healthcare has come from military medicine. And this comes through particularly when you look at the Great War. Up to the Great War, trauma had been wounds that people get when they're injured. And the Great War led to orthopedic surgery and rehabilitation medicine and prostheses and plastic surgery, which became cosmetic surgery. It led to mobile x-rays, it led to blood transfusions, it led to a lot of what we think of as being medicine today. It also introduced us to trauma, and it probably made Freud, because while a lot of people got traumatized during the war, Freud's techniques didn't help them. It was other behavioral techniques that came into play that got people better where they got better. But Freud's name came out of the war as being the name, the brand, the Freud brand came into being, probably because Freud's nephew was Edward Bernays, who at this stage was working in the United States, helping create the public relations industry, or you might call it the propaganda industry, which has been an instrument of war ever since. One of the other things I want to bring out to you here is that at this point in time, by the end of World War I, the United States had more hospitals than the rest of the world combined. They were doing surgery, not medicine. And to this day, people in the United States have more medical devices in their bodies than the rest of the world combined. And they didn't get health insurance before World War I. They were about to put universal health insurance in place. They didn't. In the end, in the 1930s, American hospitals created private health insurance, which was hospital insurance. It was aimed at keeping the hospitals going. One of the other quick things, well, actually, one more thing about the military is that to this day, you know, that surgery by robots was begun by the US military. It's now been privatized, but it begins with the military, as does telesurgery. The idea that we operate on people 2,000 or 3,000 miles away, because we're going to have to be able to do it when they're out in space. You know, we're going to have to be able to do operations from a distance. But one more point about this slide here is that there's a misleading aspect to it. Women in the Great War were not the nurses that you see here, helping brave men. The women were the surgeons and the physicians running hospitals, while the men were becoming hysterical on the front line. The war did a lot to change our perceptions of gender roles. So, when Charles got his head chopped off, it was at a time when we thought that providence was what drove history forward. God drove history forward. For about 250 years after that, the idea was more in the area of individual genius drove it forward. Before Charles got his head chopped off, we had Shakespeare, but we didn't regard his individual genius as being his alone. It was a thing that came from God. Afterwards, it was more likely to be him. But by the end of the First World War, you can make a very good case that it isn't great men that drove history forward, it's technique. Both physical technologies and behavioral techniques. Who holds the most efficient techniques holds power and capital. So, one of the other people who comes into play at this point is Max Weber, who, like Karl Marx, had ill health all his life, but in his work says nothing about healthcare anywhere, the same as Marx. He could have taken his visits to the doctor into account rather than factories which he didn't go into to do his work, but he didn't. And it was the same with Weber, who, though, in 1919 has a famous lecture on politics and describes the politician as the person who will often have to embrace tricky, dangerous, unethical means in order to do good. He's the person who has to work out how to persuade the people to take their medicine. But underneath him, Weber also pointed to the fact that there's a whole new bureaucratic technique in place. And the question is whether Weber, and this is a big argument these days, whether people like Weber and Kafka predicted the Holocaust and the role of the bureaucracy in making that happen. Whatever about the Holocaust, by the end of World War I, bureaucratic technique in medicine was actively planning how to grow the national garden. The bureaucrats, the chief medical officers in the UK and elsewhere, were working out how do we strengthen the people, and coming to some interesting conclusions about eugenics and things like that. This had its ultimate outcome in Germany, as you know, where in order to strengthen the people, the bureaucrats figured we can eliminate the unfit, the mentally handicapped, the mentally ill, or whatever, before they began to eliminate anyone else. Now, in 1945-44, at the end of the war, you've got this book appearing by Friedrich Hayek, who's talking about the virus of central planning. Again, there's nothing about health in this, there's nothing about medicine in this, even though the best example of central planning that there had been in Europe was in medicine. But there's nothing about medicine, it's all about economics. So we needed to get back to the liberalism of the 19th century. Nobody thought you could. The economies had become too complex by 1945 to think about going back 100 years. And then this appeared. In the United States, they created cybernetics. The word comes from Norbert Wiener, and it's about the science of computing. Now, not how do you program a computer, but what does computer knowledge mean? And Wiener said, look, at the heart of this is the idea of a feedback loop, as in a thermostat. You've got a feedback loop, the temperature goes up, you turn the heating down. And if you look at it, this is in biology as well. Homeostasis is a feedback loop. And everybody got awfully excited about this and figured, well, yes, and maybe this is how the free market works as well. And also, this is how we can manage organizations. Now, a simple feedback loop is not the way you'd run a health service, but if you pile feedback loops on top of one another, you can create a flow chart which looks like an organization, which with benchmarking and auditing and things like that is the kind of thing that management felt, well, this can give us a science of management. And this came into healthcare in 1980 or so with the idea of audit, which looked like a great idea to me, and I'm sure all of you back then, which was, it's a good idea to set a standard for service, and if we aren't keeping to the standard, trying to work out how to get us up to the standard, to get the right temperature in the room. Okay? Now, there's a wonderful phrase here down at the bottom by Margaret Mead, whom I'm sure you'll all have heard of, which is one of those wonderfully warm phrases: never doubt that a small and committed group of thoughtful citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has. No one knows where she said this, or when, or who about, but she was one of a small group of people that was put in place to create cybernetics. And if that's what she's referring to, it takes on an ominous tone. Wiener died 20 years later and wrote this book just before he died, saying, look, we've got a problem, guys. This idea about cybernetics can explain the free market, forget it, it can't. It's good for feedback loops, which are closed systems. It should not be applied to human systems, which are open systems, which require choice and responsibility. And he's the first person that I know of who in '64 began talking about full artificial intelligence, as we would call it now, and figured this might be a point of real peril for the human race, because techniques, closed systems, involve a handing over of responsibility, and if you've got a fully closed system, we potentially have a problem. You could call full AI full technique. Right, the 1960s were, as you'll all know, an interesting time. There was clashes going on. and probably best caught by J.K. Galbraith in two books, who in 1958 wrote a book about the affluent society, which was all about how we've become wealthier and freer than we ever were before, and this was all a good thing. Less than 10 years later, he has this book, The New Industrial State, where he's saying, well, that's fine, but it's not just a case of things are working well because the market, the free market's taking care of things for us. Actually, the invisible hand of the market, which is supplying our needs, has been replaced, or is being replaced by the invisible hand of the corporation, which is creating wants in us for the things that it can supply. And this is a whole new world. Galbraith also pointed to the fact, look, the people managing these corporations these days, who are they? They're essentially bureaucrats. These are not entrepreneurs, these are bureaucrats. And do we understand what private bureaucracy is doing? The other aspect to this was within biomedicine, a program basically in the United States and the National Institutes of Health funded probably the most explosive period of growth in our understanding of the basic kind of sciences underpinning medicine, and in particular neuroscience. This is where it really gets created. It was a time when a lot of research has been done in this area, but it was also a time that was very open to the fact that the drugs we use may be causing harms, that occupations that were involved in may be causing harms, that the pesticides we put in the environment may be putting harms. This was a time when books like this could be written in a way that they can't be written now or couldn't be written before. But at the same time, while all of this was happening, a lot of people out there were seeing the biomedical developments and wondering about control of behavior. They were seeing the psychosurgery and the ECT and the antipsychotics and drugs like this, and wondering, were these a force for liberation or enslavement? Were we being enhanced by techniques, or were we being diminished? And Herman van Praag, who used to be here when I was here last, had death threats during this period for the kind of research that he was doing. The Tokyo Department of Psychiatry was occupied for 10 years because this was a biological psychiatry department. And this is the students in Paris marching in the offices of Jean Delay, the discoverer of chlorpromazine, and more or less the creator of modern psychiatry, and they ransacked his office. Because the view was, we were being diminished, not liberated. So you've got these clashing currents in economics and medicine. The question is, who won? What was the outcome? Well, one of the other people writing at this period of time was Herbert Marcuse, and this is one of his key books, One-Dimensional Man. And Marcuse said, we've stopped thinking in favor of doing. There's an operational or instrumental approach now, which is a problem. It's governed by numbers, and the culture industries in Hollywood and elsewhere will look at the numbers of people going to a Disney movie and the number of people going to a Shakespeare play. And if there's more people going to a Disney movie, Hollywood will do Disney and not Shakespeare. In the same way in healthcare, there were numbers in a way we hadn't had before for blood pressure or glucose levels or lipid levels. And before we had tried to decide clinically between a malignant hypertension and a benign hypertension, which an old man like David Healy needs a little bit of raised blood pressure to keep his brain perfused, and you don't want to treat that, but you do want to treat a malignant hypertension, we stopped trying to distinguish. If there's any elevation of blood pressure, now that we have pills to treat it, you treat. You do. And this all came to a head in economics in Chile in 1976. And before that, we had GDP, economic metrics. But all of a sudden, you've got a thermostat put in place, which is the supply of money is going to be the thermostat. And you govern the amount of money there is depending on the target that you set, regardless of what happens to the Chilean people. And whether you're capitalist or socialist, this is going to work out because money doesn't smell. In the same way, in 1976, we put operational criteria in place for mental health, which is if you've got 5 out of 9, you're depressed. Whether you're a biomedical person doing research or a social medical person doing research, well, operational criteria don't smell, you're just going to adhere to them. Of course, you can meet the criteria if you're influenzaal or pregnant, and chances are we'll give you an antidepressant if you're pregnant and meet the criteria. Now, we won't think, could this woman be meeting the criteria because she's pregnant? You don't think anymore. And people can self-declare if they meet criteria. So I want to cut across that for a second for an event that cut across all of that, which was a French drug in German hands in 1956 comes to the market as a sleeping pill and causes horrific injuries. Now you have to remember that up till this point, no one had thought that any pill could cause birth defects. So all of a sudden we enter a whole new world alarmingly. This doesn't just cause birth defects, this causes horrific birth defects. And it leads the FDA in the United States in 1962 to put a new Food and Drugs Act in place. And the one feature of this new act is to have new criteria for measuring the efficacy of a drug. This comes from a man called Louis Lassagne. It's a new technique. RCT, well, he puts into the FDA Act the idea that we're going to force drug companies to show that their drugs work using RCTs, randomized control trials. This, at that point, is a new technique, a poorly understood technique, and often when we have a major crisis, what people do is they look at a thing and so pick it up and say, hey, this will solve the problem, and if people don't understand what they put in place, they say, oh, goody, you've got to take in place to solve the problem. Very soon afterwards, Louis Lassagne said, this is a major disaster. And I'm going to leave you to read this, I'm not going to read it. Essentially what he's saying here is that RCTs are clinically useless. Unlike fertilizers, where the first RCTs were done, which tells a farmer that if the fertilizer works in the RCT, it'll work in this field, and the next field, and the field after, and every other field you care to think of, RCTs tell me nothing about what drug to give to the patient in front of me. There are some people who respond to this problem by saying, well, this is a problem with probability theory. Fisher, who introduced RCTs, was hooked up on statistical significance. Forget that. Just go by confidence intervals and you'll solve the problem. Well, you'll know, I'm sure, that confidence intervals were introduced in 1810 to distinguish when people had a bunch of measurements of stars, they didn't all get the same answer. And the idea was, well, is this measurement error around one star, or are there 2 different stars here? Of course, that's fine for stars, but when we talk about people, the illnesses are different. Your depression may not be the same as yours. Your diabetes might be completely different to yours. And if they're the same depression and diabetes, if we give a pill, this person may respond totally differently to that person with the same pill. Confidence intervals don't solve the problem of medicines, which are poisons used to do good, like surgery is a mutilation used to do good. We don't do RCTs in surgery. Surgeons wouldn't particularly think it's a good idea. And they move forward a lot further without RCTs than we have moved forward with them. Let me bring the point home to you. The first antidepressant is imipramine, which is a lot more potent than any of the SSRIs or most of the pills we use today. It gets people who are melancholically depressed well. It was introduced without any RCTs, as most of the best drugs we have were introduced without RCTs. Within a year of it being introduced, doctors were reporting, this is great, it means I don't have to give people ECT, but it can also make some people suicidal. You give them the drug, they become suicidal, you remove the drug, the problem clears up, you give the drug again and the problem comes back. The drug has caused people to become suicidal. But at the same time, if you put it into a placebo-controlled RCT of patients with melancholia, we would expect the placebo arm of the trial to have much more suicidal events than the imipramine arm, because it's getting the condition right or well. These are not drug trials, you should know. These are disease or condition trials. If you want a drug trial, you give the drug to healthy volunteers and you see the effect of the drug. Once you give it in a disease, you are no longer seeing the effect of the drug. The SSRI trials, unlike the imipramine trial I've just shown you, notional one, shows you this kind of picture, which is that there's much more suicidal events on active treatment than on placebo. Why? Because SSRIs don't get melancholia well. The trials were run on people who are mildly depressed, almost healthy volunteers, and this is what you get. If you put imipramine into the same trials that the SSRIs were put into, you would get the exact same result. Now, what I want you to take from that is, first of all, RCTs don't prove cause and effect, ever. They don't even give you the frequency with which things happen. They're not designed to test what's going to happen when you try to do good using a poison. They cannot cope with an internal contradiction, just like thermostats can't. Let me show you a slightly different way to bring this out. This is from GlaxoSmithKline, who have an SSRI called paroxetine. And this is their document. You don't have to believe any of the figures here, but I'm just saying it's their document. I don't believe the figures here, but I'm just saying that these are their figures, okay? And you see they had a major problem in 2006. The figures they gave us about the rate of suicidal events in their placebo-controlled trials show a real problem. And there's a big fuss about, is there going to be a black box warning on these drugs for adults? So the document actually shows a line below the major depressive disorder line here, which is for what they call intermittent brief depressive disorder, which is borderline personality disorder or emotionally unstable personality disorder to most of us. And again, you don't have to believe the figures. I don't believe the figures, but these are just their figures, okay? And you see I've put on the end of the slide here what the data looks like when you add it up, which is pretty bad for both the drug and the placebo. You can add 16 suicidal events into the drug arm here, so the 32 goes up to 48, and still get the same extraordinary result, which you'll see on the next slide, which is when you add line 2 and 3 together there, paroxetine saves lives. You can add 16 suicidal events in, and it will still save lives. Why is this happening? It's happening because companies can use an effect of a drug to hide an effect of a drug, either a good effect or a bad effect, if the condition in the trial is heterogeneous, if it's not all one condition. People who are borderline personality disorder and people who are major depressive disorder all complain about being depressed. So you can, if you want, put them into the same pot and do a trial. But if they don't all have the same condition, the results are meaningless. And there's almost no condition in medicine where you get a group of people who all have the same condition. Diabetes is a mix of conditions. Depression is a mix of conditions. Back pain is a mix of conditions. Parkinson's disorder is a mix of conditions. Breast cancer is a mix of conditions. Unless you have a pure sample, controlled trials are meaningless. And as a symbol of that, the only drug that had been through a placebo-controlled trial before it came on the market, before 1962, was thalidomide. And it was run by Louis Lassagne, and the drug came out as efficacious and safe. The mechanism we put in place to stop thalidomide happening again was a mechanism that it sailed through scot-free. So let's go back to where I left off before I introduced you to all that, which is in the late 80s and things like that, people are talking about neoliberalism. And what I've said with DSM-3 is, well, We got neoliberalism and neo-medicalism at the same time. A different kind of medicine comes into being at exactly the same time. In the late 80s and the early 90s, on the back of a book by Ulrich Beck, we're talking about risk societies. Now, as of 1970, there were 200 academic articles in which the word risk appeared in either the title or the abstract of the article. By 1990, there are 20,000 articles in which it appears. Risk, we didn't have risks before 1970. The world just didn't have them. Risk is a feature of, now we have nothing but risk, but it's a feature of numbers. Once you have numbers, you create risks, particularly if you have a thing to move the numbers the way you want them to move. And risk entered medicine long before it entered politics. In 1981, Jeffrey Rose put forward the idea that medicine's making a mistake treating heart attacks and strokes and madness. What we need to do is treat people long before that, before they get ill. We need to treat them for their raised blood pressure and raised lipid levels and raised blood sugars and thinning bones and things like this. And you don't just want to treat the young male joyriders by asking them to put on seatbelts. You get the entire population to wear seatbelts. So you treat any hint of an elevation of blood pressure or blood sugar or whatever. People didn't think that, is it a good idea to give poisons to well people? Even when the trials came out showing that you can kill people doing this, nobody really has thought about it much since. So we ended up with a world where the pharmaceutical industry began handing out peak flow meters to people. They began handing out free bone scanners because they knew that any little bit of thinning of your bones is going to lead to the sales of their pills. Unfortunately, on your blood tests, your cholesterol levels, at least in the UK and the US, and probably here as well, are measured anyway on routine blood tests. So you got screened whether you liked it or not. Your consent wasn't asked, and you got put on pills. A good symbol of this is the eating disorders. The first weighing scales for people appear a few years before the first description of anorexia nervosa. The increase in eating disorders in the West and then the spread globally parallels the increase in weighing scales. And with our new health apps, which have been sold as empowering us, they're going to cause endless more nervosas. Right, so we had a new MAC medicine, right? This is quality medicine. You can reliably bring blood pressures down. Like a MAC hamburger is the same each time. So this is MAC medicine, like Macbeth in a sense, and Banquo's ghost turns up at the feast. An old-style medical illness that kills people. And this led to one of the greatest triumphs of medicine, finding treatment for AIDS, led to one of the greatest moral triumphs of medicine, the Access to Medicines campaign to ensure that people globally had access to these drugs. The philosophy that underpins it isn't from the left or the right, it's people with AIDS saying we've got to value people as they are. And this is very like what was happening in Eastern Europe at that point in time. Well, what the AIDS activists were also saying is we've got the iron cage of a bureaucracy getting in the way of us accessing drugs to keep us alive. Now, in Eastern Europe at the same time, you have a dissident movement, which is, you've got people like Lech Wałęsa and Václav Havel, saying that you've got to help people live the lives they choose to live. And there's a very powerful illustration of this, and this is in a handout that you guys have, maybe picking up afterwards, I'm unsure, but there is a handout which gives you this slide here, which I'm not going to read, but you will be able to read it afterwards. It's, again, it's about letting people live the life that they want to live. It's a dissident movement which is saying, look, we've got a new dictatorship in Eastern Europe. Dictatorships before have been the few taking over the many, but this is a few taking over in the name of the many. Dictatorships before have been against the law as it stood. This was claiming to have the law behind it. dictatorships have been temporary, but this is claiming to be permanent. So anyway, the Berlin Wall came down, and triple therapy appeared to save people with AIDS. The only drugs, essentially, apart from Gleevec and possibly Solvadi, since 1980 that save lives. We've had lots of drugs before 1980 that saved lives, very few since. So, the West won, of course, didn't they? Well, Václav Havel, just before he died, said no. The state that we're in now, the political state we're in now, is worse than it was in 1989. And within medicine, the triumph of AIDS only persuaded the pharmaceutical industry that it's not a good idea to save lives, that saving people is bad business. And the Access to Medicines campaign, which is one of our greatest triumphs, which people here in Holland in particular support. We want access to the new high-cost drugs. This is access to polypharmacy, which is going to kill people. The pharmaceutical industry are very happy with the Access to Medicines campaigns. So we didn't win. In 1984, the US pharmaceutical industry was worth $20 billion. By the year 2000, Lipitor alone was grossing $13 billion per year, and more was being put into the marketing of the drug than all the research on Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis and epilepsy and a lot of other diseases combined. The US industry in the US alone is now a $400 billion industry. And they aren't interested in triple therapy or anything like that. That's not where the money is. So what happened, or why did things go wrong? Well, the industry in the 1980s turned to assembly lines. It outsourced clinical trials to clinical research organizations. The industry don't run their own trials these days. It outsourced medical writing to medical writing agencies. They don't write their own articles these days. It outsourced drug development to smaller companies. It outsourced public relations, propaganda, to public relations companies. And the result of that is shown in this slide here, which is, these are sertraline's trials being done on PTSD. And you'll see that over on the right-hand side, there's 2 articles written from 2 trials that have been done, which in actual fact don't show the drug works at all for men, soldiers in the army. I mean, it works in a few women who've got borderline personality disorders, but not generally. This is terribly weak data. One's going to appear, though, in the New England Journal of Medicine, the other's going to appear in JAMA. And on the left-hand side, author TBD, to be determined. Donald Trump has introduced us all to fake news. Well, the greatest concentration of fake news on earth centers on the drugs your doctor gives you, and has done for 30 years. Medicine has been consuming essentially very little, at least where drugs are concerned, very little except fake news for 30 years. And that sets up a situation you see here. This is Mesmer, I believe, maybe not, but it's a doctor who's trying to mesmerize one of his patients, whom you see over here. And you see the little file. I mean, you may be able to see from his hands to her eyes, there's a bunch of little kind of magnets lining up. And this is the theory about how this worked. That's the situation we have now. Except all of us here, whether we're doctors or patients, are in the patient's seat. And the mesmerizer, the hypnotist, is the pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare corporations that we work for. And this act of hypnosis works as any act of hypnosis does, which is it's a thermostat. And as you know, hypnosis doesn't permit of internal contradictions. It's the one thing that it can't cope with. And the thermostat is all about if X, then Y, and it's if the figures for X are high or low, give brand Y. Now there's 3 things that can wake a sleepwalker or a person who's under hypnosis up. One is an adverse event if you bump into something. So if you go on an SSRI and you become suicidal, you've got to keep the sleepwalker asleep. and maybe even put them deeper under hypnosis. And you do that by persuading him and his doctor that this is caused by an other illness, bipolar disorder. If they're on oxycodone for pain and they become addicted to it, you've got to persuade the doctor that this is another illness. They've got an addictive disorder as well as their pain disorder. And as you know, once the hypnotized person does one stupid thing and doesn't wake up, the hypnosis gets deeper. And this is exactly what's happening with pills. Once the adverse events gets transformed into an other illness, the doctor and the patient are doomed. The other things that can make a difference is you don't want personal relationships. And clinical trials remove those, and a lot of clinical practice these days, which introduces rating scales from trials, because these are more scientific than just talking to the patient, does the same thing. And you don't want an act of judgment. That's the last thing you... I mean, people who walk in their sleep can do an awful lot of things, but they don't make judgment calls. And that's exactly what you don't want. So this is a book that perhaps you all know. It's one of the greatest books on healthcare there is. This is The Logic of Care. In the 1960s, most people stopped working in the kinds of factories Marx saw them in, and moved over to working in the service industries, hotels and restaurants and banking and insurance. But healthcare and education were not part of the service sector. In healthcare, it couldn't be. Like heart attacks, you don't get reliable outcomes there. Strokes or madness, you can't make a service industry of this. But of course, you can make a service industry of lowering blood pressure and lowering blood sugar, and you can bring the product to people. I mean, you can't bring heart attacks to people, but you can bring risk prevention to people as a service. So what we get is a transformation during the late 80s. Healthcare begins, and education begins to enter the service sector. And what goes is care. The idea that, well, I'm giving you a poison. This is not a thing you would do in the service sector. You don't give people a poison. You give them a sacrament. You give them something that's going to make them better. You hide from them the fact that if you've got diabetes, even though we're giving you insulin, we want you to prick the side of your finger because you may go blind and you don't want to lose the pulp, so you don't prick the pulp of your finger. There's a lot of caring involved in clinical medicine, which is not part of the service sector and won't ever be. One of the other things that helps the transformation happen is, by the late 80s, we've begun to get guidelines. All the industry trials that have been done are now being compiled into guidelines which are evidence-based. And insofar as they're based on industry trials, they're junk. They're based on ghostwritten articles where there's no access to any of the data. But they set a thermostat, they set a benchmark, so the people who begin to manage the health services at this point, who before had to depend on the discretion of doctors and nurses, all of a sudden have a standard. They can say, this is what you have to do, and if you don't do it, you're out the door. Clinical discretion becomes a problem to be risk managed in the service sector. So we end up with healthcare being transformed into something like this, which is a lot of frontline staff having very circumscribed roles. They have to keep to the protocol. A few people behind the desks who have a little more discretion, but not much. Famously, just before the Soviet Union kind of collapsed, just before the Berlin Wall came down, Helmut Schmidt looked at the Soviet Union and said, it's Upper Volta with missiles. And that's what's happened to the health services. Where care is concerned, we are now Upper Volta. We've got great instruments, great tools, we can do all sorts of things, but where the care is concerned, we are poor. We are care poor. Or, as one of my patients said to me recently. You know, when I take my dog to the vet, the dog gets more continuity of care and person-centered care than I get in the health service. So, in 1807, Johann Gottlieb Fichte introduced us to dialectics. He said, philosophy is all about rhetoric, which means propaganda and public relations. We want dialectics. We want people to engage with real life, to bring ideas into real life and encounter contrary ideas and come to a new synthesis. He was hoping to improve philosophy, but he didn't. He helped create German science. 40 years later, Marx picks up the idea and thinks this is a good idea. We want evidence-based living and workers going into factories and producing commodities which were new. Along with the bourgeoisie, we're going to see what was happening and we're going to, change their ideas in the light of what was happening. We're going to advance humanity. It was inevitable humanity was going to advance. But the revolution didn't happen. In 1990, we got dialectical operationalism, which is evidence-based medicine said, let's take the theses from controlled trials and bring them into clinical practice, and the adverse events that happen and patients' values will cause doctors to arrive at a new synthesis. With Marx, what happened was the proletariat didn't rise up. They became an affluent middle class instead and forgot about revolution. With evidence-based medicine, the middle-class medicine has become a proletariat, much more strapped into the apparatus than they ever were before. One of the key dates in this is September the 20th, 1991. A year beforehand, an article has appeared in the American Journal of Psychiatry describing 6 cases of people who become suicidal on Prozac. You give the drug, they become suicidal. You take the drug away, the problem clears up. You give it again, the problem comes back. And crucially, the patients drove this by saying, doctor, I've been depressed and suicidal before. This is different. This is a different phenomenon. By any standard of cause and effect, Prozac caused suicide. The response from the company is to produce this meta-analysis of their clinical trials, which appeared in the BMJ on the same day as an FDA hearing, saying, if you look at this, there's no evidence that our drug causes people to become suicidal. Which are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the anecdotes, or are you going to believe the science? In actual fact, if you look at the article and look at the small print, it is very clear that Prozac causes people to become suicidal. This is what the BMJ reviewer said, but the BMJ paid no heed and published the article anyway. But the defense worked in the public domain. Lilly said, you've got to remember, the plural of anecdote is not data. Now, the original phrase, for those of you who know, from 1969, was the plural of anecdote is data. This is, if it weren't, polling wouldn't work. If it weren't, Google wouldn't work. The idea that the plural of anecdote is not data was used principally during the 1970s by the paedophile liberation front to justify themselves, but is now one of the major tools in corporate risk management. As a result of Lilly's defense working, journals changed. They couldn't afford to take case reports of things going wrong on pills, which you didn't see anymore. Instead, they took the fake news of RCTs and meta-analyses of RCTs, for which companies paid them a fortune. Drugs bulletins, which we all used to get routinely, vanished. You had to pay for them now. Instead, we began to get guidelines, which you didn't ever get before, for free. They showered on us, and these all talk about the benefits of drugs and not the hazards. Harms vanished. Our patients vanished in front of our eyes, and we vanished in front of the people who run the health services' eyes as well. The phrase risk-benefit ratio emerged, and many of you will have seen this phrase, and you think you know what it means. Let me tell you how it translates. It translates into regulators have agreed they won't warn about hazards for fear of putting patients off from a treatment that might give them benefits. That's what it means. Since 1991, if you have an adverse event, you're up against the science. And here's a quote from Louis Lassagne again, which I'm not going to read out, which brings that out, because I'm sure you'll be able to read it while you're listening to me, which is, if I have a patient whom I put on an SSRI and they become suicidal, the scientific job is to work out what's going on here. And you do that by a clinical interview, taking a history. If you can do a lab test that helps, you do that. You introduce the drug and maybe remove it and reintroduce it, or you change the dose, you introduce an antidote, and based on all these things you work out, is it likely that the drug has caused a problem or not? So let's say I conclude that the drug has caused the problem. What we've now got is a world where the media and the powers that be will all say, well, actually, the science says something different, so your conclusion's wrong. It's just not scientific. That's not the case. Every doctor should be sticking to their conclusion. It looks like the drug or the vaccine or whatever has caused the problem. The next scientific task I've got is to explain the mismatch between what seems to be the evidence base and what I've concluded clinically. In the case of the SSRIs, the mismatch comes about because there's no access to the data from the clinical trials, and all the trials are ghost-written. It's not, but when you get access to the data, you see that actually the clinical trial data is consistent with what I'm seeing clinically. So to bring that point home, this, I think, I hope, is the most famous clinical trial ever done. This is study 329, which appears in the journal with the highest impact factor in child psychiatry, with an authorship line to die for, which says that paroxetine works extremely well and is safe in children who are depressed. Now, no doctors rumbled this. No doctors said this doesn't match my clinical experience. It was the media, and it shouldn't be left to the media to unpack this story, which is that the article didn't hold water. This was 2001. Some years ago, we got access, a group that I work with, to the data behind this trial. This is the only trial that I know of where an independent group has had access to drug company data, the actual raw data. And when we analyze it, using whatever method you care to use, you cannot show this drug works. The most interesting thing about the trial was that it was a compendium of the ways in which adverse events can be hidden. I'm only going to show you one of the adverse events, which is children becoming suicidal on this trial. And the original paper is down in the box on the bottom, and there's 5 children becoming suicidal on paroxetine compared with imipramine and placebo. Most people didn't spot that they'd become suicidal because the paper talked about children becoming emotionally labile, which is a legitimate coding term you can use. There's nothing illegal about it, but you know, this is how it was couched. When a fuss blew up in 2004 about all this, the FDA asked the company for their data, and the company came clean and said, well, there were actually more suicidal events than is in that paper, okay? Now, the first thing you need to realize about this is it means that FDA don't have the data. You guys all think the regulators, EMA, FDA, have access to clinical trial data. They don't. Okay, when there's a problem, they have to ask the company. And they may have gotten something a bit closer to the data, but actually they asked the company for their report of what the data showed. Okay? And the company comes clean and says, actually there were more events than you know about, perhaps. When we get access to the data, we find there were 3 times more events than there were in the original paper. FDA are told with 2 times more events. But don't worry, it's not statistically significant. When we look at the data, and we don't have more events have come to light since, it is statistically significant. I mean, I don't think you should ever use statistical significance for adverse events, or in controlled trials, probably. But I'm just saying to you, the company defense was untrue. Now, there is study329.org where you can see all of this data, the original paper and our paper and the background behind it. There'll be a book later this year which will give you the most delicious conflict of interest story about this study that you've ever heard in your life, as well as telling you who is sleeping with who in order to produce this crisis. But you're going to have to go and buy the book, which will be called Children of the Cure when it comes out. But I want to go on to this, which is, as of the time this fuss blew up, there were 70 open-label studies done on antidepressants in children, all glowingly positive. Now, we know that somehow or other doctors can give pills to children, and they are transformed. They become better than well, and they glowingly write these things up. But because we know there can be a bit of slippage for one reason or the other, we like to do a controlled trial. And if the controlled trials don't show the drug works, we stop using the drug. Well, as of 2004, when the fuss, which is caused by a journalist looking at this study 329, not doctors, not academics, when it blows up, there had been, as it turns out, 20 controlled trials done in children, all negative. In every single trial, there was an excess of suicidal acts. In one of them, the TABS trial of fluoxetine, there were 34 suicidal acts on fluoxetine compared with 3 on placebo. There were 7 publications from independent academics on this study. Not a single one draws your attention to the 34 versus 3 suicidal events. Prozac is on the market for children in Europe and the United States. It is in WHO's essential drugs list for children. You've got to have 2 positive trials for a drug to get on the market. The 2 positive trials are in there under the negative, under N. They're both negative. As were the paroxetine trials, study 329 and 2 others, that FDA agreed with GSK are negative, but were happy to approve paroxetine for children before the fuss blew up. So since 2004, there have been 10 further trials. There's more than 10,000 children that have gone into trials of antidepressants, all negative, all with increased suicidal events. This is the greatest concentration of negative trials for any condition in any age in history. What's happened to the prescription of antidepressants? Well, in teenage girls, barring oral contraceptives, these are the most commonly used drugs now. In 1974, 4 Irish people were jailed because there were 2 bombs in pubs in England which killed 4 people. The 4 Irish people became the Guildford Four, and a few years later, after they were jailed, it became clear they were innocent. The English legal system facing this came to the conclusion that you read here, which is they've got to stay in jail forever, because if the public find that they're innocent, they'll lose confidence in the law. And we can't have that happening, can we? Well, I was an expert witness in this case. James Holmes went into a movie theatre in Aurora, Colorado in 2012 and shot dead 12 people and injured 60. He ends up in jail, he ends up on trial. I get asked to give a view, I go and interview him, I get all his records, I see everything. My view is he's as innocent as the Guildford Four were. He clearly pulled the trigger, he killed 12 people, he injured 60, but it wasn't James Holmes that did this. Several months before he'd been put on sertraline, because he was shy. And as the dose went up, he became disinhibited, change of personality, he became homicidal. He tried to tell his doctor, look, you'd lock me up if I told you what was on my mind. They paid no heed, and he ends up going and killing people. His defense, now, you guys can't clearly take a view on James Holmes just based on what I've said. I'm not asking you to. What I'm asking you to take a view on is this. His defense team were told this. He was being tried in a state with the death penalty. His defense team were given a great defense. They chose not to run it. They tried to persuade the jury instead that he was mentally ill, that he had schizophrenia, which he clearly didn't. Okay, so the problem the defense were up against was the fact that they'd have to tell the jury that Pfizer, 30 years beforehand, had given this drug to healthy volunteers and made them aggressive. They had concluded their drug could cause aggression. They would have had to tell the jury FDA had approved this drug. They would have had to tell the jury the entire literature is ghost-written. They would have had to tell the jury there was no access to any of the data. And they felt they couldn't go there. My hunch, although I can't prove it, is that a deal was done between the prosecution and the defence that he wouldn't get the death penalty, that he would be sent to jail for over 3,000 years, which is what's happened. Now, you guys aren't in the same position as the Guildford 4 or the Aurora 1. You think it's a long way from your experience. I'd like to suggest to you that it's not a long way from your experience at all. Every one of you, whether a doctor or a patient, are in exactly the same position these days, working in a health service if something goes wrong. The family will come along and try and work out, they'll be asking what happened. And they'll meet a health service team, nice people who talk to them very friendly, who will show them that we've kept to every guideline, we've kept to all the benchmarks, we did a perfect job. And the family will go away totally mystified. It could only be different if when the health service are analysing what happened, let's say it was caused by sertraline or whatever, if they're analysing what happened, that there's a box in the protocol which says medicine-induced death. But that box can only be there if you've got steps in place to reduce the risk should this be likely to happen. And you can only have steps in place if you realise we're dealing with a lack of access to the data and a ghost-written literature. It's above the pay grade of anyone who runs any health corporation or any service. It's above the pay grade of any Minister of Health in Holland or elsewhere to put a box like that in place. So every one of us is in the same position as James Holmes and the Guildford 4, I think. This is the Václav Havel position, where if the service is going to decide something went wrong, they're going to blame the doctor or the nurse who was handling the drug. That's who they're going to blame. They're not going to blame the drug. And this is creating, it means we're all working in a hostile environment. We've got a target on our back in a way we didn't have before. And it's creating dissent among patients, but in particular among staff in the health services in a way that wasn't there before. I've changed Europe to healthcare at the top, and I've changed all the he's to she's, because if we're going to make a difference here, it's going to take balls, and that's going to come from women rather than men. Pilots and doctors have tricky jobs, and both have adverse event systems. And as we know, as you've seen with the Boeing aircraft, just this week there are planes all over the world grounded, because if there's an adverse event, pilots will report it, and if the system doesn't pay heed, they don't fly, because they don't want to die. I mean, if you die on a plane flight, they die too, so they don't want to die, so they report it, and the system responds. If you have an adverse event on a drug, your doctor does not report it. He or she reports 1 in 100 of the serious adverse events that happen. And she doesn't report it because she figures that if she reports it professionally, well, he figures if he reports it professionally, he will die. So you don't report it. Now, the problem is he or she are going to be out of a job if we don't report these things. Because if drugs work wonderfully well and are free of problems, well, there are cheaper prescribers than doctors. There's nurses, there's pharmacists, there's all, and in due course there'll be robots. So, you know, if we want to hang on to our jobs and relatively good rates of pay, you've got to be an expert that justifies the price. And the argument has to be, it takes expertise to bring good out of useful poison. I thought you'd like one more execution. So here's Walter Raleigh. We're just at the end. And there's two things about this. One is it's 1623, and of course we wouldn't have had the Brexit problems if Walter Raleigh had been around. For those of you who don't know, he was the person who defeated the Spanish Armada. And if we'd had a person like him around today to make sure that the Spanish fishing fleets didn't end up taking all the fish out of the North Sea, there wouldn't have been a Brexit problem. But anyway, this is the night before he's executed. This is what he writes in the prison cell. It just kind of shows in Shakespeare's time, everyone who was English spoke Shakespearean. I mean, just wonderful stuff tumbled out of their mouths the whole time. But the reason he's here is that because of his execution, there was a change in the law, an important change in the law that affects all of you, which is Raleigh was convicted on hearsay. People not in the court said awful things about him. They were reported in the court. And after he was executed, the legal system decides you cannot convict a person on hearsay anymore. Hearsay is just not allowed. Okay? Now, the problem is, when your doctor reports an adverse event, her name and the patient's name is removed from it when it goes to EMA or FDA. So that if David hears an adverse event on a drug and goes into court and tries to say, well, look, there's been 1,000 other reports to EMA about this problem happening on this drug, the court's response is, that's just hearsay. You can't bring it into court. If you're going to make a difference to this, you've got to leave your name on the report, and the patients have to leave their name on the report. And if you and your patient report the same problem, you both agree with what the problem is, and file it with EMA with your names on it, that's something the courts cannot ignore. The legal system will come to a full stop if you're both prepared to go into court to be cross-examined. As things are at the moment, the pharmaceutical defense team will say, look, we can't bring people into court, Your Honour, and the judge will say, well, fine, well, we can't pay any heed to that. So there's a bunch of Irish tricks as we fought the English, which was the boycott. This is an Irish invention. What we need now is a reverse boycott, which is, rather than not talking to people, we need to talk the whole time about the adverse events drugs cause, with our names on them. Flood people with these things. This is a way to better drugs. The single best way to discover new drugs is through their adverse events. This is a way to make neuroscience flourishing, because all sorts of drugs, from the statins to the antibiotics, cause behavioural changes which should really feed neuroscience. We also had the hunger strike, which is an Irish invention. But one more thing, clinical trials. In court, they won't bring adverse event reports in, they'll bring clinical trials, and the pharmaceutical industry will say, we have all of them. But actually, that's hearsay. There's no access to the data. When we get access to the data, we find that patients don't always exist. There's no one can be brought into court to explain to the court that their emotional lability was, I was actively suicidal and homicidal, Your Honour. The clinical trials we've got, which are the evidence that convicts all of us these days, are hearsay. So what I suggest is another Irish invention you've been hearing a lot about lately, the backstop, which is we do not prescribe drugs without access to the data. We tell the industry that it will be in breach of international scientific treaties if we don't have access to the data behind these drugs. It's not science, and I'm not going to prescribe something that's not based on science. So, another Irish phrase, this is an Irish phrase, it comes from the Irish Wars Against the English, die on your feet or live on your knees. It sounds violent. I'm not asking anyone to go out there and be violent. It wasn't a violence phrase. It was about standing up for ourselves through hunger strikes and things like that. And I've got it paired with a woman here. I don't know if any of you know who the painting's by. It's a Klimt painting. You probably guessed by the style. Those of you who know your Klimt paintings will know that it's not the whole picture here. The pharmaceutical industry target women as wives and mothers and daughters, because they know these are the people who are most concerned about the people around them. What they need to be aware of the fact is that women are the people who are most likely to get engaged and change things when things go wrong. And this is a picture of Judith. And anyone from the government who will ever watch this, or the regulatory apparatus, or the pharmaceutical industry, need to get the full Klimt picture here, which is, this is Judith holding the head of Holofernes. Those of you who don't know the story should probably read it. We're just finished. I'm not asking you to chop off heads. It may well be for the men here, and the women are the ones who are really going to sort it out, but for the men here, you don't have to do anything like chop a head off. It may be that the answer is going to come a slightly different way. And again, I've got to thank Donald Trump for this, okay? Which is, techniques can enhance our are diminishes. And this is not an anti-technique lecture. It's not an anti-drug lecture. I use drugs. I don't use anything else. Okay? The question is, techniques themselves don't care. They're indifferent. If it's got to be us that care. And the question is, how do we use them in a way that enhances us all rather than causes problems? Donald Trump helped me with this recently when he talked about, in response to one of the school shootings, he said, all we need is a good guy with a gun in those schools. And a lot of people were horrified and said, you can't be serious. And he said, well, if a good guy with a gun won't work, why do you have good guys with guns outside the White House? Which is a tricky one to answer. But on the other hand, we still feel that while guns are a good thing, they're an effective technique, that if you multiply them up too much, they'll leak into places they shouldn't be, and they can potentially cause more harm than they're worth, and they get in the way of us finding better solutions to certain problems. And ultimately, as the nuclear bomb shows, which is an extension of the gun, there's a limit to efficacy. You get the nuclear bomb, which is so effective, we can't use it. And Vietnam beat the Americans who had the nuclear bomb. We've reached a nuclear moment in medicine. This is the last slide for those of you getting restless. Life expectancy in the United States for the last few years has been falling. Not just falling behind other countries, actively, in absolute terms, falling. Last year in the United Kingdom, life expectancy fell. Across Western Europe, except in Spain, life expectancy has stalled. For 200 years with the medical model, life expectancy rose, and I think that's a good thing. It wouldn't have happened with homeopathic medicine or complementary medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. It's a good thing. But we've reached a limit to efficacy. In the 1980s, we were on 1 pill a day at most, and then for short courses. Now, 40% of the population over 45 are on 3 or more drugs every single day of the year. 40% of the population over 65 are on 5 or more drugs every single day of the year. We've known since 2010, if you can get people down to 5 drugs or less, that life expectancy improves, that the rate at which they go into hospital reduces, that their quality of life is enhanced. We're at a point where, in order to get optimal efficacy, doctors and patients working together have to collaborate. And if, as I've said, power and capital goes with optimal technique, it's a point at which we need to take back power. And if we do it in healthcare, we might be able to work out how to solve the climate change that's happening more widely as well. Thank you.